Good to be here. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I want to take a moment to welcome my mother-in-law, Liz Igra, who is here from Sacramento. Many of you will remember her from shepherding a great deal of nachas at Rena's bat mitzvah those many years ago. Just a word about Liz, because she won't do it herself. Liz runs the Central Valley Holocaust Educators Network, which is an organization that she founded after a career in education and being one of the co-founders of the Shalom School in Sacramento. CVHEN, as it is known, is an organization that has multiple programs. Most importantly is that it teaches educators how to develop age-appropriate and grade-appropriate Holocaust curriculum. One of the more exciting programs is a partnership with SF State that teaches pre-service teachers how to go into their career knowing how to teach Holocaust. It's critically important work. There's also a second-generation program that the organization runs. And Liz will be with us for a Kiddush if you want to ask any questions about the organization. But she's here to shep nachas on me. I'm here to shep nachas on her. The Sac State just granted her an honorary doctorate of humane letters last month, a couple of months ago. So welcome. All right. So I had a little bit of a dilemma in deciding what to do this week. You know, for those of you who've heard me give drashot before, I have 3 rules. It's always about the parsha, none of my personal experience or politics, and I'm in and out in 12 minutes, which I do for Oscar's benefit. But I wanted to talk a little bit. I thought for a moment that I would speak a little bit about the situation in Israel and how troubling it is. And I realized after cogitating on it that I won't do that. And the reason I won't do that is because I think we are all aware that Israel is a moment of absolute crisis, but that we as American Jews have very little that we can offer. There's very little we can do about it right now except pray. You know how to do that without me? So rather than getting us all depressed about something we care deeply about but can't control, I decided to go back to my 3 cardinal rules, so I'm going to talk about the Parsha. In this week's Parsha, Moshe continues his closing address to Klal Yisrael, reaffirming God's promise to the patriarchs that if the people observe the mitzvot, they will prosper in the Holy Land. The Parsha presents a number of important ideas about observance, about reward and punishment, and ultimately about how we should live our lives. The Parsha begins, Vayehi ekev tishma'un et hamishpatim ha'ela ushomartem v'yositam atem. It shall come to pass because you will listen to these ordinances and observe them and do them. Because. But the Hebrew word used for because here is not ki, as you would expect. It's ekev, which is a very unusual use of the word, and I think the only time in Devarim that it's used in that context. And so the rabbis, of course, spent 2,200 years of cogitating about it, and came up with a number of explanations for why this strange word is used. The word ekev can also mean heel. And I mean heel in the sense of the back of one's foot, not Elon Musk. And it suggests, according to the rabbis, that we must take care to observe all the mitzvot, even those we often, quote, walk all over, because we don't consider them important. That's an interpretation of Rashi. Another interpretation comes from Reb Moshe Liba of Sasov, the Sasover Rebbe, who also is the ultimate founder of the Sasover Hasidim, who continue to exist in Brooklyn. And Reb Moshe taught that the word ekev is used to remind us that every ekev, every step, should be in harmony with the mitzvot. Reb Moshe ties this idea to Proverbs 3:6, in all your ways must you know God, to teach that the uncommon word ekev is God's reminder through the mouth of Moses that every moment we live is an opportunity to do mitzvot. But it's not always easy. Moshe speaks of the manna, that Klal Yisrael received during the 40 years of wandering, referring to the Lord who fed you manna in the desert in order to test you. Well, that doesn't make sense. Without the manna, they would have starved. It was a good thing. Why was it a test? Rashi explains that what God means here is not the manna itself, but the constraints imposed on the manna. You couldn't gather it on the Shabbat. You couldn't save it for a second day. It had to be an act of faith to accept that the manna would come day after day as needed to feed the people. And that is the test. It's the test of belief. Rashi teaches thereby that wealth, plenty, can be as great a test as poverty. As the Maggid taught, when we face trouble, sickness, or danger, we all become religious. There are no atheists in foxholes. Rashi and the Maggid are both trying to warn us that our faith is measured not in time of trouble, but in times of plenty. In other words, when you don't have to have faith, do you have faith? And that's the test that Moses refers to when he speaks of the manna. But perhaps the most difficult part of today's parsha is the notion of fearing God. Moses says, "What does the Lord your God require of you but to fear Adonai, Yirah et Adonai, always?" In the Talmud, Reb Chanina says, everything is in the hands of heaven except the fear of heaven. That part is left to humankind alone. And this commandment is unique because every other commandment in the Torah requires an object on which to act, right? You need a house to put a mezuzah on. You need food to keep kosher. You need parents to honor. You need another person not to harm. But not this. This is the only mitzvah that requires no object. You are to fear God. Now, the term would seem to refer to man fearing God. But the Baal Shem Tov, founder of the mystical tradition of Hasidism, interpreted it as God's fear. But how could God fear anything? God's God, after all. The Baal Shem Tov explains this with a parable. To a young child, a parent says, if you run into the street, you'll be punished. And the child doesn't run into the street for fear of punishment. But an older child, a more mature child, a thinking child understands that the reason not to run into the street is not because you're going to get a whop on the tuchas, but because you're going to get hit by a car. So it is with God and man. Not following the mitzvot harms one's soul, but like the young child, we may not always understand why we should observe. And so teaches the Baal Shem Tov, Hashem punishes transgression as a deterrent. God fears for our welfare, fears that in our lack of knowledge we may do things that harm us. We should understand, says the Besht, that God's fear we harm ourselves from transgressing far outweighs God's wish to punish transgression. In this light, our parsha says, and now, Israel, what does Adonai ask of you but to fear God, to go in all God's ways, and to love God? Loving God and fearing God are the two most difficult commandments to fulfill. We fear a policeman who might give us a ticket. We love our children most of the time. These things are tangible, earthly relationships. But how can we love or fear a God that does not seem to communicate with us in any way we can understand? Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, an 18th century Italian scholar, taught, there are things a person must imagine to acquire the fear of God. The first is that one is actually standing in Hashem's presence and communicating with Hashem, although Hashem cannot be seen. Rabbi Luzzatto, who was of the mystical tradition, teaches that with great effort and meditation and certain thoughts, you can accomplish this. But we are not all mystics. And even if we all were to follow Rabbi Luzzatto's teachings, we still face a problem. How can commandments like love and fear be commanded? Commanding us to love does not make us love. Commanding us to fear does not make us fear. So what then does it mean to be commanded to feel an emotion? And how can one fulfill that command? The Rambam presents this approach to loving and fearing God. Rambam says, what is the path to love and fear Hashem? When a person thinks deeply of God's wondrous and awesome creations and actions and sees from them God's infinite wisdom, one inevitably and necessarily will love, praise, glorify, and desire to know Hashem. And when one thinks of these things, one inevitably also will become afraid, knowing that we are small creatures standing with feeble intelligence before the perfect and complete knower of all things. The Rambam thus teaches that pondering God's awesome creations will lead unmistakably to loving and fearing God. And this is the approach that we are to take to an intangible God. And if we see God through the wonder of creation, we will appreciate each and every moment and thereby fulfill our lives. That's hard, right? I mean, what if we are skeptical of a creator who fashioned all things? What if our knowledge of biology, geology, astronomy, and above all, 20th century history make it unable for us to make that extraordinary leap of faith? We learn from Proverbs 17:24 that one's skepticism need not be an impediment to the commandment to wonder at creation and the resulting ability to be aware of life as it happens. Proverbs says, wisdom lies before an understanding person, but a fool's eyes are directed to the ends of the earth. Rashi interprets this to mean that only fools concentrate on ends and goals, while the wise consider the process, the here and now, what lies right in front and before them, and that this is the path to follow. This, I think, is most importantly what we should and shouldn't do. Moses teaches also that Hashem wants us to appreciate the process of living. A story. A very elderly man was facing the end of his life. When his rabbi came to him to say the vidui with him one last time, the man said to the rabbi, "First, I was dying to finish high school. Then, I was dying to finish college. After that, I was dying to get married. After that, I was dying to have kids so I could marry them off and relax. Then I was dying to retire." And he says, "Now, I'm just dying. And I fear that I never lived." Although our parsha commands us what to do and not to do in each moment, its essential lesson is this: to spend our time in this world wisely, we must appreciate each moment, each present moment, and not be looking out towards something in the future. The process, living, is what counts. May it be God's will that we each can learn to do just that, to experience each moment of life, whether a simple walk in the neighborhood or a day spent with children or grandchildren, or even times of sadness and loss, thinking only about that moment as it happens. Whether one considers that to be a commandment of Hashem or simply a personal discipline, it is a way of living that will nourish and sustain us and bring fulfillment and peace of mind and soul. And with that, I ask you to join me on page 149. At the bottom of the page, the personal meditation. Avinu Malkeinu, bless our family with peace. Teach us to appreciate the treasure of our lives. Help us to find contentment in one another. Save us from dissension and jealousy. Shield us from pettiness and rivalry. May selfish pride not divide us. May pride in one another unite us. Help us to renew our love for one another continually. In the light of your Torah, grant us, the people of Israel and all your children everywhere, health and fulfillment, harmony, peace, and joy. Shabbat Shalom.